It was November 30th, 2001, a calm, gray morning in Seattle. Detectives from the King County Sheriff's Office waited outside a truck paint shop called Kenworth Trucking, quietly watching a man in his 50s sweep the floor. He looked normal, average build, clean shirt, calm face. Just another working man starting his day. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway. He had no criminal record in years. He was married, had a steady job, and lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Auburn, Washington. To his neighbors, he was polite, quiet, the kind of man who waved when you passed by. But today wasn't a normal day, because inside the detective's car was a DNA test result, one that matched Gary Ridgway to at least 4 murdered women, their bodies dumped near the Green River 2 decades earlier. When officers approached him, Gary smiled politely, thinking it was just another work inspection. But when they said the words, "You're under arrest for the Green River murders," his face didn't change. No panic, no denial, no anger, just a calm, chilling emptiness, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. What no one around him knew was that this ordinary man was America's most prolific serial killer, responsible for the deaths of 71 women, maybe more. He had killed while married, gone to church on Sundays, and even helped police search for the killer himself. And for almost 20 years, he lived among his victims' families, driving past memorials built for the very women he had strangled. So, how did this man, hiding behind an ordinary smile, manage to deceive an entire city? And how did one of the largest manhunts in American history finally bring him down? Let's rewind. It all began in the summer of 1982, near the Green River in Kim County, Washington. 2 young boys were playing near the water when they spotted something strange, a floating shape tangled in weeds. At first, they thought it was a mannequin, but as they got closer, the smell hit them. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a body. The victim was Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old runaway. She had been strangled and left in the shallow water. Detectives arrived, thinking it might be an isolated case. But within a few weeks, more bodies appeared, 5, then 10, floating in or near the Green River. All young women, all strangled, all left in almost the same position. Panic spread across Seattle and surrounding towns. The media called him the Green River Killer. The women had one thing in common. Most were sex workers or runaways from the city's Pacific Highway South area. They were young, vulnerable, and easy to disappear. And for the killer, they were perfect prey. Detectives worked around the clock, forming one of the biggest task forces in Washington state's history. Hundreds of officers combed through forests, creeks, and abandoned roads. But for every body they found, another seemed to appear somewhere else. One detective said, "We were chasing a ghost." And that ghost was Gary Ridgway, a man who lived just a few miles away. By day, he painted trucks. By night, he cruised the highway in his pickup, looking for his next victim. He often brought his son along in the car on family trips, using it as a disguise for innocence. Other times, he would pick up women, drive them into the woods, strangle them, and then go home to dinner with his wife. His chilling pattern was simple. He targeted women he thought no one would miss. He killed fast, dumped their bodies near rivers or in clusters of woods, and went back to living his ordinary life. For years, the Green River Task Force gathered evidence. Fingerprints, shoe prints, fibers. But nothing matched. Technology at the time couldn't link DNA as it does today. So, the case grew colder, even as the number of missing women kept rising. In 1984, a man named Ted Bundy, already on death row in Florida, reached out to the task force. He offered to help them understand the mind of the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer would return the bodies, revisiting them to relive the crimes. He was right. Ridgway sometimes went back to his dump sites, sometimes to move bodies, sometimes for even darker reasons. But still, the police couldn't find him. Gary kept his calm. He had already been questioned 3 times between 1983 and 1987, and each time he passed lie detector tests. To detectives, he seemed cooperative, just a simple man trying to help. What they didn't realize was that they were shaking hands with a killer they'd been hunting for years. By the late 1980s, The murders slowed down. Some believed the killer had died or left the area. Others thought he was still out there, hiding in plain sight. They were right. Gary had remarried. He was attending church regularly and leading Bible study groups. He had stopped picking up women as frequently, learning from the mistakes that had drawn attention before. But the darkness inside him hadn't gone away. It had simply gone quiet. For the next decade, Ridgway went unnoticed, working at Kenworth Trucking in Auburn. He was punctual, quiet, a model employee. Even his boss said he was the kind of guy you'd trust to lock up at night. No one would have guessed that just miles away, deep in the woods, dozens of women's remains were still waiting to be found, all victims of the same man sweeping that truck floor. But everything changed in 2001 when DNA technology finally caught up with him. Detectives had preserved old evidence, tiny samples of saliva and semen from the original crime scenes. When new DNA testing methods became available, they re-examined those samples. And after nearly 20 years of chasing shadows, the lab confirmed the impossible. The DNA matched Gary Leon Ridgway, the man they'd interviewed years ago, the man who'd smiled and offered coffee to detectives searching for a killer, the man who'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time. When officers arrested him that November morning, Ridgway didn't resist. He just said, "Why now?" And in that moment, they knew he was guilty. But what they didn't know yet, what no one knew, was just how many women had died by his hands. The number wasn't 5 or 10. It was far worse. And when Ridgway finally spoke, his words would horrify even the most experienced investigators. After his arrest in 2001, detectives and psychologists were desperate to understand how a man like Gary Leon Ridgway, a soft-spoken, neatly dressed factory worker, could live a double life as one of America's most prolific serial killers. When investigators sat him down in that cold, gray interrogation room in King County, they expected resistance, excuses, or denial. Instead, Ridgway looked him in the eye, calm as ever, and said something that made every officer in that room freeze. "I killed so many women. I lost count." There was no emotion in his voice, no anger, no regret, just a quiet confession, spoken like he was describing a list of chores. Gary Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and grew up in a troubled home. His father, a bus driver, often spoke about the sex workers he saw downtown, filling young Gary's head with disgust and curiosity at the same time. His mother, a strict and controlling woman, constantly criticized him and humiliated him publicly. Psychologists later said that combination, hatred toward women mixed with desire and shame, may have planted the seed for the man he would become. As a teenager, he struggled in school, often described as slow by teachers. He wet the bed until his teenage years, and his mother's reaction to it, washing him, scolding him, only deepened his resentment toward women. At 16 years old, he committed his first violent act. He stabbed a 6-year-old boy who had wandered into the woods, leaving him bleeding but alive. When questioned, Ridgway said he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. Even from a young age, something inside him was broken. As an adult, he seemed normal, average job, steady income, but beneath that calm surface, Gary carried an obsession. He was addicted to control. He hated the feeling of being powerless, and nothing made him feel more in control than holding another person's life in his hands. In interviews, he told detectives, "Killing was my career, my job. I did it so well that nobody noticed." He often targeted sex workers because he believed no one would report them missing. He said, they were easy to pick up, easy to get rid of, and hard to trace. To him, they were not people. They were targets. He developed a chilling routine. First, he'd drive down Pacific Highway South, sometimes right after work at the truck factory. He'd keep his truck spotless, his clothes clean, and his tone polite. When he spotted a woman, he'd pull over, show his wedding ring, and pretend to be a harmless family man. He'd offer her a ride or money, and once she was inside, the clock started ticking. He'd take her to a quiet wooded area or a deserted road. He knew those places well, hidden corners near the Green River construction sites and forest trails that only locals used. Once parked, He'd talk casually, pretending to be friendly. But as soon as he sensed they were comfortable, he'd strike. He often strangled them from behind, quickly, with brutal precision. He said he preferred strangling because it was personal. He wanted to look them in the eyes as they realized what was happening. Sometimes, he'd use a ligature like a rope, a belt, or even their own clothing. Other times, just his hands. He learned to kill quietly, efficiently, and without leaving marks that could identify him. When it was over, he'd dump the bodies near rivers, trails, or dense woods. He often left them nude to eliminate evidence, sometimes scattering rocks, branches, or garbage over them to hide them from view. Then he'd go home, shower, eat dinner with his wife, and watch TV, completely calm. To him, the murders were like clocking out of work. He once said, "It was my second job, and I was good at it." The terrifying part wasn't just how he killed. It was how easily he moved on afterward. While families searched desperately for their daughters, Gary was mowing his lawn, helping his neighbors fix their cars, and attending Bible study groups. He'd pray, smile, and shake hands, sometimes on the same day he killed. He wasn't a man fighting guilt. He was a man enjoying the secret power of living a lie. Even his wife, Judith Mawson, had no clue. She believed she'd finally found her perfect partner, gentle, funny, and caring. She said later, "He made me feel safe. I didn't have to worry about anything when Gary was around." But when investigators later told her the truth, she said she felt like she'd been married to two different people. Inside prison interviews, Ridgway tried to explain himself, but his explanations only made him sound colder. He said, "I didn't feel hate when I killed them. I just didn't feel anything. They were just objects I wanted to get rid of." When asked why he strangled instead of using a weapon, he said, "I didn't like blood. It was messy. Strangling was clean." That sentence alone revealed how detached he was from reality. To Gary, murder wasn't emotional. It was routine. He learned to control his impulses. He avoided areas with security cameras, picked times when police patrols were light, and constantly cleaned his truck. He even kept souvenirs from his victims, jewelry, clothing, little things he could hold later to remember them by. He hid those trophies around his house, sometimes giving pieces of jewelry to girlfriends, pretending he bought them. But what truly baffled investigators was how he stopped. By the early 1990s, the killings slowed down. There were fewer missing women, fewer reports of bodies. Some believed he'd finally stopped killing. The truth was, Gary had simply grown cautious. After being questioned multiple times in the 1980s, he realized he was on the police's radar. He still had the desire to kill, but he learned to suppress it when he felt the pressure rising. Psychologists said he was a controlled psychopath. He didn't kill because of rage. He killed because it made him feel powerful. And when that power became risky, he put away like a tool until he felt safe again. For nearly a decade, he stayed quiet, confident that he'd beaten the system. But he couldn't outrun science. In the late 1990s, DNA testing advanced rapidly. The Green River Task Force still had evidence. Tiny samples of saliva and other biological material from the early cases. When they tested those samples again, they found a match. That match pointed straight to Gary Leon Ridgway. He had left traces of himself on 4 of his victims: Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen, Opal Mills, and Cynthia Hines. All had been found in 1982 and 1983, near the Green River. It was the breakthrough detectives had waited almost 20 years for. When they finally confronted him in 2001, he didn't fight back. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Why now?" That quiet, emotionless question told detectives everything they needed to know. Inside, Gary already knew it was over. He'd always believed he was smarter than the police. He wasn't. Technology caught him in a way old-fashioned detective work never could. Once he began confessing, it was as if a dam broke. He described in stunning detail where he had taken each victim, what she had said, what she was wearing. He could still remember the curves of dirt roads and the smell of the trees where he left them. Sometimes, he even smiled when talking about it. Detectives called it a chill smile, a calm, emotionless grin that made them shiver. When the first bodies were discovered in 1982, no one in Seattle could have imagined that the investigation would last nearly 20 years, involve hundreds of officers, cost millions of dollars, and become one of the largest criminal manhunts in U.S. history. But that's exactly what happened. The Green River Killer wasn't just dangerous because of how many people he murdered. He was dangerous because of how perfectly he blended in, how carefully he avoided mistakes, and how easily he stayed one step ahead of law enforcement. And for 2 decades, it felt like he was always watching police, while they had no idea he was right under their noses. The discovery that changed everything, 1982. When the body of Wendy Caulfield was found in the Green River on July 15th, 1982, it didn't immediately trigger panic. But when 4 more bodies appeared within weeks, Debbie Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Opal Mills, all strangled, all found near the same river, the King County Sheriff's Office realized something terrifying. A serial killer was hunting the Seattle area. They formed the Green River Task Force, a massive team of detectives, sergeants, and analysts whose only job was to find the killer before more women vanished. But the killer kept moving faster than they could. Every time they found a body, weeks or months had already passed. Evidence was washed away by rain, scattered by animals, or degraded by time. Witnesses were unreliable or long gone, and the killer seemed to choose victims who were already vulnerable, runaways, young girls surviving on the streets, women who had no one to check on them regularly. To investigators, it was like chasing a ghost, and that ghost was Gary Leon Ridgway, the killer hiding in front of them, 1983 to 1986. The first time investigators noticed Gary Ridgway was in 1983, when a witness said she saw a pickup truck near where one of the victims was last seen. The truck looked similar to his, so detectives invited him in for questioning. They sat with him for hours. He answered every question politely. He never raised his voice, never slipped up, never looked nervous. He even offered to take a lie detector test, and passed. Years later, experts confirmed he was able to stay unnaturally calm even in tense situations. He gave the police a saliva sample, fingerprints, and hair. He thanked them for their work, and walked out the door a free man. That day, detectives didn't realize the truth. They had just interviewed the Green River Killer himself. Ridgway went right back to work, right back to church, right back to life, and the killings continued. The task force grows desperate. By late 1983, the list of missing women had grown to an alarming number. More victims were found in clusters, sometimes 2 or 3 bodies within a few feet of each other, hidden under branches or buried in shallow spots just off the highway. Detectives searched rivers, forests, and abandoned lots day and night. They brought in helicopters, bloodhounds, divers, and cadaver dogs. Nothing worked. It felt like Ridgway was always ahead, carefully choosing places where evidence wouldn't last. The task force grew so frustrated that in 1980, for they even consulted a prisoner in Florida who claimed to understand the mind of a serial killer, Ted Bundy. Bundy told them the killer would likely return to the bodies after the murders, especially if he had some emotional attachment to them. He also said the killer probably pretended to be helpful or friendly to his victims to gain their trust. Every detail matched Ridgway perfectly, but at the time, police still didn't have the science to prove it. The evidence piled that went nowhere. By the late 1980s, the task force had mountains of evidence: shoe prints, fibers, paint samples, truck tire impressions, witness statements, hundreds of hours of interviews, but none of it legitimately tied anyone to crimes. Ridgway remained a person of interest, but he wasn't the only one. There were over 40 suspects. As the years passed, the case slowed. Some investigators retired. Others were reassigned. New evidence rarely came in because the killer's pace had slowed as well. To the outside world, the Green River Killer was gone. But the truth was darker. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was just being quiet. The breakthrough of a lifetime, 1997 to 2001, everything changed with advances in DNA testing. In the early 1980s, DNA technology barely existed. By the 1990s, it was powerful. By the year 2000, it was precise enough to match biological evidence to a specific person with near total accuracy. The Green River Task Force re-examined old evidence, tiny traces of saliva, bodily fluids, and microscopic fibers collected from the first murder scenes in 1982 and 1983. They sent them to the lab. Weeks passed, then months. Finally, in early 2001, the results came back, and the match was clear. The DNA on 4 victims matched one man, Gary Leon Ridgway, the same man who'd been questioned in 1983, the same man who had smiled at detectives, the same man who had passed a lie detector test. After nearly 2 decades, the case broke open, the arrest that shocked his neighbors. On November 30th, 2001, detectives surrounded Ridgway outside his job at Kenworth Truck Company. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't even look surprised. He simply said, "Why now?" Those 2 words told officers everything. They were finally face to face with the killer they'd been chasing for 20 years. His co-workers were stunned. To them, Gary was quiet, neat, reliable. They said things like, "He was the last person I'd expect." He was always polite. No one suspected the man painting trucks beside them had murdered dozens of women and hidden their bodies across King County. The confessions begin 2002 to 2003. Once confronted with the DNA evidence, Ridgway's carefully built mask cracked. He confessed to 48 murders, later hinting the number could be over 70 or even 90. He walked detectives to forest sites, rivers, and trails where he remembered dumping bodies years earlier. Sometimes, he pointed to a patch of earth and said, "She was right here." Even 20 years later, he remembered the exact spot. He helped police recover remains that had been lost for decades. He described how he killed, why he chose his victims, and how he avoided detection. In exchange for these confessions, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Ridgway received 49 life sentences, 1 for each known victim, though many believe the true number is far higher. How the case finally ended. The hunt for the Green River Killer officially ended in 2003, when Ridgway was sentenced. But for many families, the case will never truly end. Some victims were never found. Some remain unidentified. And the real total number of women Gary Ridgway murdered may never be known. After 20 years of terror, 2 decades of searching, and thousands of hours of investigation, the killer who had fooled an entire city, the killer who was behind a polite smile, was finally behind bars forever. When detectives finally sat across from Gary Leon Ridgway after his arrest in 2001, they expected a battle, denials, long pauses, excuses, or anger. They expected the usual defenses most killers use when they were cornered. But with Ridgway, nothing was normal. The moment they slid the DNA report across the table and told him that he had been matched to 4 victims from 1982 and 1983, he didn't ask how, or what do you mean? Instead, he lowered his eyes, rested his hands on the metal table, and said in a calm, almost tired voice, "You've got me." There was no shock, no panic, no attempt to talk his way out. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment. What unfolded over the next months became one of the most horrifying confession processes in U.S. history. Ridgway talked in a soft, steady voice, revealing years of murders with the emotion of a man reciting items on a grocery list. He didn't fumble over dates. He didn't hesitate when describing how he killed. He remembered the clothing his victims wore, the words they spoke, and the exact spots where he left them in the woods, long after time and weather had changed everything. Detectives who had worked homicide for decades said later that they had never seen anything like it. Ridgway didn't brag. He didn't show off. He didn't act proud. And somehow, that made everything 10 times worse. He confessed like a man who had simply been doing a job, one he believed he did well. One of the first things he told investigators was, "I killed so many women, I lost count." The words chilled everyone in the room. It was the ultimate confirmation of what detectives had suspected but never proved, that the number of victims was far higher than the 48 he would eventually plead guilty to. In fact, Ridgway hinted several times that the total might be 70, 80, or even 90. Investigators believe many victims were never found, and some may never be found. He explained his methods with terrifying clarity. He said he chose young women along Pacific Highway South because they trusted him. He said he looked safe, with his clean-cut style, quiet demeanor, and wedding ring. He often used his family man image as bait. He'd smile, talk gently, and offer rides. Many of the young women he picked up got into his truck, believing they were stepping into safety, not danger. He used that trust like a weapon. After driving them to secluded areas, forests, dirt paths, remote driveways, riverbanks, he would strike suddenly. He preferred strangling because it was quiet and clean. He said he didn't like blood, didn't want to mess, and didn't want to draw attention. Often, he killed with his bare hands. Sometimes he used ligatures like ropes, shoelaces, or clothing. He bragged about how quickly he could kill someone, saying he'd learned exactly how long to squeeze before his victims went limp. What horrified detectives most wasn't the killing. It was how easily he returned to his everyday life afterward. Ridgway said that after killing a young woman, he would go home, wash up, eat dinner with his wife, tuck his son into bed, and go to work the next day without losing a minute of sleep. He described murder as something he scheduled around his work shifts. He referred to it as my second job. He also explained why he chose many of his victims. His words were sickening and deeply insulting to the girls and women whose lives he stole. He said he believed society didn't care about them, so he assumed no one would look for them or miss them right away. Detectives had to keep control of their anger as Ridgway expressed these cold, detached views. But the darkest part of his confession came when he talked about the places he hid the bodies. Ridgway didn't scatter them randomly. He organized them. He created what he called clusters, often leaving 2 or 3 victims in the same general area. He treated these areas like burial zones that only he had access to. Detectives had spent years searching those woods and trails, but Ridgway knew the terrain better than anyone. He described how he used large rocks, branches, and weeds to hide the bodies. He sometimes visited the sites days or even weeks after the murders, not out of guilt but out of curiosity. Some detectives believed Ridgway returned to the sites for darker reasons, but he avoided answering those questions directly. What he did say was unsettling enough. He visited the bodies to see how they were doing. Ridgway spoke about his victims like they were objects, not human beings. He rarely used their names. When shown photos of missing women, he identified them by the places he left them, not by their lives or identities. He remembered tree lines, road shapes, and the sound of nearby traffic. He remembered the weather on certain nights. He remembered what kind of shoes they wore. He remembered everything except their humanity. The emotional void inside him was something investigators had difficulty describing. He didn't smile wickedly. He didn't show anger, and he didn't display satisfaction. He was simply empty. Detectives said speaking to him felt like speaking to a blank wall that could talk. There was no emotion or remorse behind his words. That changed only once. During his sentencing in 2003, the courtroom was filled with the families of his victims. Many came confront him to tell him how he had destroyed their lives. He showed no reaction as mothers cried or fathers trembled with rage. His face stayed still, cold, and almost bored. Then one grieving father stood up and said, "I forgive you." Ridgway broke. His face twisted. His breath trembled. He began to cry, loud, uncontrollable sobs echoing through the courtroom. Psychologists later explained that forgiveness confused him. It was the only emotion he didn't understand. He could face anger, hatred, and grief without blinking. But forgiveness shattered him because it was something he had never experienced and had no idea how to respond to. The rest of his confession process continued, and Gary kept revealing details the task force never expected. He admitted to giving away jewelry from his victims to girlfriends as gifts. He admitted to stopping killings temporarily when he felt police pressure. He admitted that he sometimes kept victims' clothing hidden around his house. And he admitted that he never stopped because of guilt. He said, "I stopped because I didn't want to get caught." That was the only reason. Not remorse, not shame, not fear of judgment, just fear of losing control. It was clear from his confessions that Ridgway didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as someone who had a task to complete and did it efficiently. That cold logic, the lack of emotion, the precise memory of every killing. These were the elements that made his confession some of the most haunting ever recorded. To this day, detectives and psychologists believe Ridgway murdered far more women than he admitted. Many bodies may never be found. Some victims may forever remain unidentified, and some families may never know what happened to their loved ones. Gary Leon Ridgway's story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not always the ones who look frightening. Sometimes, they're the ones who smile at their neighbors, attend church, raise families, and blend seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday life. Ridgway hid behind normalcy like a mask, one he wore so well that it fooled almost everyone around him for decades. His crimes tore open the heart of Washington state. Families waited years, sometimes decades, to learn what happened to their daughters. Detectives aged while chasing one man who seemed to disappear like smoke. And a region that once felt safe was forced to confront a truth that still echoes today. Evil doesn't always show its face. Sometimes it holds a door for you. Even now, behind the thick concrete walls of Washington State Penitentiary, Ridgway lives a life stripped of freedom, stripped of secrets, stripped of the calm mask he once used to deceive an entire city. He moves quietly through the prison corridors, serving out his 49 life sentences, one for every victim they could confirm. And yet, everyone knows that number was only the beginning. The Green River Killer's legacy is not just a tragedy he caused, but the extraordinary resilience of the families who fought for answers, the detectives who never gave up, and the community that learned how to rebuild hope after years of fear. Their courage stands in sharp contrast to the coldness that defined Ridgway's life. And as the years pass, the story remains a warning. The most terrifying killers are often the ones no one suspects. A smile can hide the darkest intentions. A quiet man can carry the loudest horrors. A normal life can hide an unimaginable truth. This story is a tribute to the victims, young women whose lives were stolen, whose dreams were cut short, and whose families still carry their memories forward. They are not forgotten, and they never will be. If you want more deep, gripping stories like this, stories that shine a light on hidden truths, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Echoes of Fear Stories. Your support helps bring more real stories to the world, stories that deserve to be told and remembered.